fields, when the Portuguese mariners and the Spanish mariners came over to the Americas and they began colonizing. It's actually very, very interesting. A lot of my latest research, the newest documentary I've been working on is about law. And it's really getting more into kind of what I've shown in my other films about admiralty law, but it actually gets a little bit deeper into those subjects, and I actually trace back through the history of law. And that was where I really started finding some correlations. When you go back through the history of law, you find some correlations between the modern bar association today, that's the basis for our common law here in America, and the Knights Templar. And then how the Knights Templar were obviously killed off in the I guess it was the 1300s. A lot of them were killed off, and a lot of them were forced underground. In France, they were obviously killed off. In England, they were really just, they were brought to trial, many of them found not guilty, and then and in Portugal, they actually went from the Templars of Tomar, I believe it was, and they basically just changed the order, the title of the order, into the Order of Christ. And from there, a lot of that money that was originally in the hands of the Templars, a lot of that money then went into the Order of the Christ. And then from there, the first Grand Master of the Order of Christ was Henry the Navigator, which was the son of King Edward I. And that's when you actually start getting into, you find out that a lot of those navigators, he's the one who set up the School of Navigation, or the School of Navigators, and that started the long campaign of all of the mariners finding the new Americas, navigating through that school, which was another form of it was in some way, shape, or form a secret society in and of itself, because it trained a lot of the individuals that came over into the Americas, because then, surprise, surprise, his successor as Grand Cross was Prince Ferdinand. So, and we all know about Ferdinand and a lot of a lot of what happened later, or just maybe 100 years later, 100 to 200 years later, over in South America. That's why in Brazil they speak Portuguese. That's why in Peru and many of the other places they speak Spanish, because of the Spanish and the Portuguese mariners set up through this school. They were funded by the same money that came from the Templars, and that was how that kind of fed into the Americas. But back in England at the same time, what you actually find is right after the Templars had the Inner Temple and the Middle Temple out in London, and there was a Temple Church attached to it. And that still exists today. When they were kind of forced underground, and some of them were accepted into the Knights Hospitallers, what I was doing a lot of, this is where it gets into the law that I was looking at. When you trace back law, especially common law, back into England or Great Britain, what you find is that in London, all common law comes from what you hear about, like the Bar Association. We have the American Bar Association. There's bar associations everywhere. Almost every single in every single Commonwealth, you'll find a bar association. Well, that all goes back to the 4 Inns of Court in London, which is Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn, the Inner Temple, and the Middle Temple, which are these 4 Inns of Court that resides in London. And that is where the current form of law all comes from. And that it's the same, the latter two, the Inner Temple and the Middle Temple, is where the Templar actually had one of their main headquarters. So it's kind of interesting how all of this ties back into these ancient conquests, these religious conquests. And that's kind of where my research has been leading me lately. But to stay on point, long story short, when I was doing research during KYMATICA on genocide of all the tribes, it actually directly tied in with a lot of this research that I was doing in the Holy Crusades. Because what then happened, as soon as they started finding not just different religions elsewhere, but some of the most true religions that some of the most ancient religions were there in what is now today the United States, Canada, Mexico, South America, because in fact, if you look far enough back in time, you'll actually find that ancient Phoenician mariners, well before the time of Christ, thousands of years before the Common Era, Phoenician mariners actually colonized a lot of the places here that eventually were taken over by the Native Americans that we see. So you'll actually find Phoenician and ancient Irish inscriptions on mounds right here in the United States from thousands upon thousands of years ago. Which is extremely interesting. So, I mean, when you're looking at history, a lot of things are definitely untold, and a lot of things have been tried. A lot of these things have been tried, have been suppressed, and tried to wipe it off the face of the earth in many ways. So that's when you see all the book burnings and all the suppressions of these specific tribes, because there were some tribes that they didn't even care about. There were some tribes that really didn't practice a lot of these ancient forms of mysticism and religion and shamanism, the ancient magi and the sages. They didn't deal with any other tribes but the ones that were that had some form of contact with the ancient world of the Phoenicians and beyond that, really.
Interesting. And it's funny because today it seems like there's a renaissance of interest in what the indigenous tribes have to say. And my last guest is an astrologer, and she, her friend Junvalo Melchizedek, has a lot of contact with the Mayan elders and the Kogi and the Hopi and so on and so forth. And she was mentioning that the Hopi have said that the prophecies have all come true except for the last one, and that had to do with the red sun or the red star. And then she mentioned that there's a star that's going supernova at some point called Betelgeuse. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but more so than that, you've done research in electromagnetics, and there are many of my guests and many quantum physicists as well who are talking about the Earth slowly losing a bit of its gravitational force, and the poles are starting to move around. And of course, the indigenous tribes say that this is part of the cycle that happens every 25,600 years, and then, there are millions of year cycles, and then there's one that's 16.5 billion years if you follow the Mayan calendar all the way back. And Terence McKenna had his time wave zero theory that kind of dovetails into all that, and it ends at 2012. So, have you done much research on that? And another thing, too, that many of my guests are going to Peru to have various otherworldly experiences with cactus juice and in Peru and ayahuasca and so on and so forth to find out for themselves what this is all about.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned Terence McKenna because, he was, decades ago, he was really in the midst of all this research with specifically with shamanism. And his time wave zero understanding of novelty was really quite interesting. He actually he had some different beliefs with people, say like John Major Jenkins, even though they were close colleagues, where Terence McKenna actually believed that it would be a kind of a sudden thing around the turn of 2012. It would be almost kind of like a sudden, rapid thing, and John Major Jenkins actually believes that it may have been somewhat of a 36-year span of the whole shift that's what we're actually going through. And but yeah, I mean, as far as everything that actually goes with the electromagnetics with this, it was really difficult to find. It's very easy to find information on electromagnetics. However, it's kind of difficult to find a lot of the information that really correlates with some of the questions that I had, because there are definitely what we see as there are questions of the electromagnetism, the electromagnetic poles of the Earth actually weakening almost to a 0 point, and there's other research of it wavering actually. And when I got into my research of the Schumann resonance of the Earth, it's actually really interesting because there are 7 of them. Well, there's actually more than that, but there's I showed in KYMATICA there's actually 7 of them, and they actually bounce around, and they within themselves they are vibrations, but they themselves also fluctuate vibrationally. So it's kind of part and parcel to the 7 resonances that we have within us, such as the chakras. And also the seven lights, the 7 archangels, the 7 expressions, the 7 Elohims. And what I mean by 7 lights, I meant the 7 colors that you would get if you were to force pure white light through a prism. You get the 7, the whole spectrum, the 7 colors. And what's interesting about that is where I was actually getting into a lot of the newer work that I've done. If you look at the tree of life, or the Kabbalistic tree of life, you'll have the Ein Sof Or above the tree of life, which is that unlimited light. They call it the absolute. And that light, once it starts its descent through the tree of life, it first hits the supernal triangle. And it's interesting that they use a triangle. For one, there's a trinity there, and you see the trinity within every single religion. And the trinity always has to do with creation, maintenance, and destruction. No matter what it is, that always has to do with that creative force. And what's interesting about that is it's above that is Ein Sof Or, and right below it is the supernal triangle of Keter, Chokmah, and Binah, and then below that are 7 spheres that go all the way down to Malkut, which is the kingdom, the physical world. And that right there is one of the most ancient depictions of light, with the Ein Sof Or, the unlimited white light, that pure white light being forced through a triangle or a prism, that supernal triangle, and there being 7 different expressions. So within those 7 lower spheres, below the supernal triangle, what you find is those 7 expressions within us, which are the chakras. And that was why I got into where you find 7 there's 7 chakras, 7 continents. There's the 7 Elohim. There's 7 endocrine glands within us, and it's really interesting. This number 7 keeps on showing up in things that are very relevant to these forces within us. And we actually go back and looking at alchemy, and you see these 7 planets. From the moon all the way to Saturn. Those 7 planets that have 7 different metals attributed to them, 7 different colors attributed to them, and those aren't just random. It's very important to understand how they actually, what the occult significance is of all of them. So how this all ties in with electromagnetics is it's all vibration. It's all an energetic force. And so this is when you and I were talking previously about there being agents or disciples of light and agents or disciples of dark. It's really interesting because that is the thesis of KYMATICA. KYMATICA is that dance between matter and vibration, the active principle and the passive principle, the masculine and the feminine. And the one thing that I alluded to, but I didn't actually come right out and say in KYMATICA, is that it all comes back to electromagnetics, because there's these 3 forces. You have the positive force. This is the reason for having an alternating current. You have your positive, or your active, and you have your passive. And there's always that third force that's really the mystery between every trinity that you see. It's always that third force, and that's the equilibrating force. And from there, the first Grand Master of the Order of Christ was Henry the Navigator, which was the son of King Edward I. And that's when you actually start getting into it. You find out that a lot of those navigators, he's the one who set up the school of navigation, or the school of navigators, and that started the long campaign of all of the mariners went from the Templars of Tomar, I believe it was, and they basically just changed the order, the title of the order, into the Order of Christ. And from there, a lot of that money that was originally in the hands of the Templars, a lot of that money then went into the Order of the Christ, and then fields, when the Portuguese mariners and the Spanish mariners came over to the Americas and they began colonizing. It's actually very, very interesting. A lot of my latest research, the newest documentary I've been working on is about law. And it's really getting more into kind of what I've shown in my other films about admiralty law, but it actually gets a little bit deeper into those subjects, and I actually trace back through the history of law. And that was where I really started finding some correlations. When you go back through the history of law, you find some correlations between the modern bar association today, that's the basis for our common law here in America, and the Knights Templar, and then how the Knights Templar were obviously killed off in the I guess it was the 1300s. A lot of them were killed off, and a lot of them were forced underground. In France, they were obviously killed off. In England, they were really just, they were brought to trial, many of them found not guilty, and then, and in Portugal, they actually